We've got a really exciting episode to share with you guys today. We just had the lovely and very insightful Samantha from Mates in Mind join us. We've just partnered with the charity, so super excited to announce that. And today we've been going through a number of really interesting topics, so I'd definitely give it a listen to understand why in construction we've got some mental health issues, particularly with the nature of the industry. We discuss some actionable strategies and some resources that organisations can use to try and help and improve mental health, particularly within construction. We also explore how we can all take a role in helping to promote mental health within the workspace. So really excited for you guys to be able to listen to it. I'm really excited for the conversation we've got today. It's tackling something that's important to everyone around the table. For me personally as well, having dealt with some mental health issues myself over the last couple of years, it's a topic I really am excited to get into and something that definitely needs as much attention as we're giving it today. So the subject we're going to be going through is mental health in construction. I heard a stat recently that it was something like over 60% of people who work in construction at some point have had some sort of mental health issue. And when you think about it, you know, there's probably some structural reasons for that. They work the long hours, often away from home, the physical strain, and potentially a bit of a culture around maybe not speaking up. So today we've got really well qualified and excellent people joining me to try and unpack some of those things. So to start with, we've got two from CFS, so Patrick and Sarina. It's really great to have you here. They're both mental health qualified first aiders in our business, which is great, and it's something that we are definitely trying to push forwards from the top. And we've also got Samantha, who's joining from Mates in Mind. It's great to have you. I think it's super interesting, your history. You've been MD for Mates in Mind for just over a year now.
Yeah.
And prior to that, you were CEO of WPF Therapy.
Yes.
That's super interesting. We were talking about it before in terms of you can see it from both sides of the coin, both managing mental health practitioners and then also dealing on the front line. So to kick off, it'd be great to hear kind of what your learnings are about mental health in construction and also your perspective in having that previous role.
Thank you. It's really good to be here. So I think, as you've highlighted, we know that construction is struggling in terms of mental health problems and particularly around people reaching crisis, which is a focus for all of us and a concern. I think, though, that we also know that construction isn't alone. So many people in society are struggling. As a charity, we work across sectors that have higher risk. So there is commonality with other sectors like farming and agriculture, transport and logistics, and manufacturing. And what we're seeing in all of those sectors is that people are experiencing strain within their work, and they are also experiencing that strain perhaps going out into their wider life, and they feel ill-equipped to deal with it. And often that means that they end up feeling isolated and alone with those burdens and not feeling able to reach out for help. So I think there's something about construction being unique, but also having things that we can all understand, and that means we can apply learning and we can certainly do things that are helpful and can make it better. And I guess my background is both quite broad in that I come from a background where I worked as a research psychologist and I worked as a manager, and I've enjoyed leadership, and in some ways quite narrow in that all of my roles have involved a focus on working with people to deliver services that help them lead better, healthier lives. So I've worked to implement clinical services from a mental health perspective, but also alcohol and addiction services in community settings right through to secure and prison settings. And then ultimately, before Mates in Mind, as a charity chief exec for a psychotherapy training and provider organisation. But I think in all of those roles, it's the same. It's about working with people and understanding where they're at and how we can make good for workers, but also how we can help bring what we understand to the people that need our help at that point in time. So that's how I come to the role.
Certainly sounds like you were very well qualified in terms of your background. I guess in diving into construction, but I guess not just construction, because you mentioned there's a few other industries which share the similar traits, but in particular in those types of industries and construction, what are the things that you've picked up or you can see, or some of the issues, and maybe how we can start trying to address some of those problems?
I think in construction, if we start with the day at work, it's always worth thinking about what's the day like and what's going on in those days that stack up into making it particularly challenging for people. And you talked about some of those in the start. So people are often leaving home before it's light and getting home after it's dark, or they're staying away from home. Then they are going to work in an environment where they might be around lots of people, but they can't really connect with them, not least because you're wearing loads of PPE a lot of the time and it's a noisy, dusty, dirty environment, or you're in an environment that isn't noisy, dusty and dirty, but nonetheless you're having to wear PPE, or you're working alongside people you don't know that well, you're part of a changing workforce on a project, or you don't really have time to chat and connect. So I think whilst you might be surrounded by people at work, or working alone, you're often quite isolated within that time at work. And then the way in which the work happens often involves a lot of pressure because time frames are tight, the finances are tight, something doesn't come through on time, somebody doesn't want to do their bit on time, and that pushes back into your work, and you feel that you don't perhaps have control over your working day, your workload, the tasks, how they're going to be delivered, but you've got that pressure of that delivery point and that financial constraint coming to you pretty hard. And then that does lots of things. So I think that puts strain on the individual within the day, and it makes it hard to make choices that might help you feel better. So we might say a whole list of things that will help people feel better, but it's hard to cook from scratch if you're having to grab food from a service station on your way at the end of a long working day or on your way in. It's hard to go and exercise in daylight first thing, which we might know is really good for you. Actually, you've got to be in the car for 2 hours before that, or in a van, or you're on site and you're in digs, and you can't get good sleep. So I think those things are happening, and it's about how do we recognise what really is set within construction in terms of people's working days, and what might we change to make it better, what could we do differently, and then thinking about people coming into construction. So, for example, we know it's a male-dominated workforce. We know there's high levels of neurodiversity, and we know that people are coming in from backgrounds where they have often struggled within education, and we know that people have often had financial instability in their backgrounds. And all of those things might turn out really positively. So people can come into construction, it's an amazing sector, and people can thrive, earn well, and actually have a fantastic career and progress. And that's a huge opportunity. We want people to know that, because it's a sector we all depend on, and I think people do really do well within the sector. But we also know that if people don't get support perhaps around financial literacy and are able to plan for contracting, for example, able to save for their tax bill, if people don't get support perhaps around how to manage the instability within contracting, then that can feel really daunting, and people can feel unable perhaps to take time off between contracts, or to not work when they're unwell, or to plan for their retirement, or to just feel confident to actually choose when they work to some extent. So I think there are some things that we know those that are thriving do, and those that are struggling don't do. So the question is, how can we intervene to make those changes? Same with emotional literacy, as I would describe it. How can we help people know what they're feeling, communicate it, and know where to get help if they need it, and know the same about their colleagues? How can we help people to understand what they could put in their day to keep themselves well, to protect their mental health? So things like, how do you prioritise getting good sleep? What does that mean? And what are the factors that help? And how do we fit that into a working day? So they're the sorts of things we're thinking about, I think, particularly in construction. So how it's interacting both the sector and what's specific about the sector, and the individual that's coming into the sector.
I definitely think, having been in construction now for a number of years, all the things you just mentioned I've seen on a regular basis. But what sort of specific things are Mates in Mind looking at in terms of actions to support with some of those challenges?
So I think the first thing we think is really important is to help everyone in the workforce, whether that's directly employed by the organisation or through the supply chain, because we know those at the end of the supply chain are most at risk. So finishing trades are most at risk. So we want to encourage organisations to think not just about their own employees, but that wider network they have and how they can help the sector as a whole, because really it is one workforce. And so if we could think about it like that, and then how can we help everyone working to start to understand their own emotional well-being, their own mental well-being, so that they can understand what they're feeling, what that means, communicate it, verbalise it, put it into words, tell somebody. And how can we make sure that the person they tell is open to that conversation, so they know their own feelings and they can have a conversation about how they feel, about mental health, about what's going on in someone's life. They had a row that morning with their kids. What does that mean when they come into work? They have got a deadline that they can't meet. What does that mean? How can they talk about those things and the impact they're having on their mental health? And then ideally, we'd like to see that emotional literacy supported at what we would think of as a management level. So anyone in the organisation that has responsibility for teams or staff, so that they can really encourage those conversations and can purposefully invite them. How are you doing? How are you really doing? What's going on at home? What are your digs like? How's your journey? You know, what's that deadline mean in practice? What are we having to do there to actually deliver that? And to think about the way in which work impacts us personally, and to have those conversations in a way that feels confident and natural, and so that the person inviting the conversation knows they don't have to fix the problem. That's not for them to solve. They don't have to be a therapist. What they need to be able to do is be open to a conversation, tolerate it. It might be uncomfortable, but that's okay to have an uncomfortable conversation. They can really help. And then help the person find support if they need it. So being confident about where to signpost to is really important. And that's what we do at Mates in Mind. We help organisations develop those two levels of conversation. And then we do lots of other things, as you know. So we do things like, if organisations already have mental health first aiders in them, we think that's fantastic. How do we help those mental health first aiders become change agents? How do we support them? How do we get them to form peer relationships? We offer webinars where we can connect them to other mental health first aiders in other organisations, so you can share learning and support. I've had this come up. What did you do about it? What's your organisation doing? Because as a charity, we want to make sure that we're using resources well. So if we're creating something once, we want to share it across all the organisations we work with, so that they don't have to create the same thing, the same content. And then we think about, what can we do to support organisations in their practice? So how do we help them with legal compliance, things like stress risk assessments? We've got templates, but our support managers are also on the end of a phone and can help talk you through how to do that. We've got trainings available. We've put trainings in video clips so that people can get it quickly and easily. And then we have lots of information available and resources for all of the important days throughout the year, so you can share them with the workforce and you can encourage conversations around them. So a whole raft of things, right through to leadership interventions. We offer programmes around reverse mentoring for leaders, so that they can learn from experts within their workforce on mental health and start to think through a mental health lens. If I make that decision in business planning, what does that mean from a mental health perspective? How will that impact our employees? How might that impact more widely? And at that point, you're thinking about sustainability, aren't you? Human sustainability. And that's exciting, because then you're really thinking both at an individual level and right through at scale.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think one of the challenges, I think particularly within construction, is the cultural issue in trying to open those types of conversations. And so I think it'd be useful for us to maybe talk about some of the impacts of mental health. I think that mental health is now the leading cause of sickness across companies. You've got, from a top line business perspective, such a massive problem there. So it'd be maybe good to talk about that in a bit more detail and seeing what you've seen from Mates in Mind side, and then obviously we can kind of add from our own business perspective about some of the impacts of if this isn't addressed.
I guess to add to that, part of this and our research from looking at some of the statistics around it, and as someone who works in finance and HR and then has obviously transitioned to psychotherapy, even when I'm looking at, say, retention, sickness, stress, productivity, even presenteeism, I'm still quite surprised by some of the statistics. So with mental health first aider training that we did, it says that over 50% of staff illness is due to mental health, which I kind of sit here and say to myself, I should kind of know that. But when I sit there and read the statistics, even I'm surprised, and I'm someone who's interested in this area. Some of the other statistics that came up is that a third of managers can feel out of their depth supporting mental health. Only 10% of people seek support for mental health. Obviously, being in finance as well, one of the other statistics with the mental health first aider was that with one top accounting firm, 64% of managers thought about quitting due to their well-being. I was surprised by some of those statistics, and I'm kind of in the field, so to speak, finance, HR and psychotherapy. And I just wonder whether some of those statistics still hit home for you.
Yeah. I mean, it's sobering, isn't it, the level at which people are struggling on a daily basis. I think we know that, but perhaps on another level it feels hard to know, because it might feel like we don't know what to do about it, and that can make it really hard. But I think if we think about our families, our friends, our colleagues, our wider network, we know that people are struggling. And so the question for me is, how do we know that? And then how do we think about relating to people in a way that invites those conversations, normalises them? We know we don't have to fix them, but we do know support is out there, so that the statistics are something that for us is a reminder, I guess, rather than something we don't know quite what to do with. The other thing I think about when I think about the statistics is the level at which people don't disclose mental health problems. So the number of people that will be reporting that they've got stomach problems, or will be reporting that they've got chronic back pain, or indeed are feeling that, because actually that's how the feeling shows up in them rather than as an emotion, or are self-medicating, whether that's alcohol in the evenings or something else at weekends, or something online. So all of those things, I think, are ways people are self-medicating or distracting from feeling emotional distress. And we all know it. You know, that's, before we started this morning, I joked about having to walk past a shop that I really like. And maybe that's a bit of distraction, because a bit of shopping, you know, is a nice treat. But there's something about knowing it and recognising it in ourselves and others, but also recognising when it's become unhealthy and it's having negative impact. So I think about the statistics, and I think about the cost to individuals and organisations and society. Because, of course, if people are being just present at work because they feel they need to be there to earn, they're also going to be just present at home too, because it's very hard to be that blunt in your feelings and not have that carry into other areas of life, and that has huge negative consequence. So we all want to be emotionally engaged and present, don't we, at work and at home? And I think work can actually help people with their mental health, whether that's arising through difficulties at work or at home. We all know that sometimes we can go into work and we've had a difficult morning, and actually you can meet your colleagues, you can have a chat, you can laugh about it, but you can share the experience, and actually you can feel better. Just as sometimes you go home from work and you can, you know, feel better, or it can sort of work the reverse. So what I wonder is if we can create work environments where we normalise talking about mental health and mental well-being, and how we look after that on a daily basis. And maybe if that conversation feels too daunting for people, we can talk about the foundations of good mental health. So it's very hard to have good mental health if you haven't had good sleep. Really hard. Which is why, of course, when you have young children, you often feel like you're struggling because your sleep goes, and that makes it really hard to feel emotionally stable on a daily basis. We can all cope with a couple of nights, but when it goes on night after night, that's really difficult to manage. So in construction, we know that people struggle to get good sleep because of the long hours, because of working away from home, because they're not able to do the things that help with good sleep, like getting light early in the morning, like exercising outside routinely, like making sure you only have caffeine in the morning and not in the afternoon, like not self-medicating with alcohol to try and take you down at the end of a day because you need to decompress. So I think we can ask people things like, how did you sleep? What are your digs like? How are you coping with the journey and being on site? And that can feel challenging, I understand that. But I reckon as an employer or as a project lead, we do have a responsibility to think about the way in which we're contracting people to work and whether that actually allows them to be healthy. So if we're contracting people to work in a way that means they cannot possibly be getting enough sleep, I think we need to be thinking about that, because that has long-term impact, and it has impact for all of us in terms of how people are going to perform at work and how they are going to be in themselves. We need to be thinking about how people can live a healthy life and work. And I think we can have conversations about that. We can say, this is what I do to look after myself. This works for me. What works for you? What are you doing? How are you fitting in the things that you need to do to look after yourself? And that conversation isn't explicitly about mental health, but is about how we look after our health. So that's what I would encourage.
Yeah.
And I think it's no good me going in and saying, this is what I do to look after myself, because for many in the workforce, that is not going to resonate. They're going to look at me and think, yeah, I'm not you. But if a colleague says, this is what I do to look after myself, that is different.
From speaking from a personal perspective, I think when you're struggling with something, I think people's first reaction is they don't really know what to say or how to approach it. It's not that they don't necessarily care, but when you go through school or grow up or go into your career, no one really gives you training on how to approach those conversations necessarily. And so often people say nothing. And so I'm interested in getting your experience about how to approach those conversations, but equally before even having that conversations, how to spot the sign when someone looks like they might be struggling, or what are the things that people need to be looking out for, and how can they approach that conversation?
To add to this, some of the resources that we looked at with Mates in Mind was around the risk factors and the protective factors as well. And they can seem really obvious when they're written down, you know, the risk factors around discrimination, disability, trauma, that type of thing, if it's obvious and it's right explicitly in front of you. And then also you were talking about the protective factors around having your support network, exercising. And also I think kind of as a corporation and as leadership, we have a responsibility to be a protective factor for our staff, as opposed to becoming a risk factor for our staff. And so I think that on paper, it can be quite obvious that those signs are there. But I do think, to Henry's point, they are more subtle than that. And, you know, I've had a case not at CFS, but in another organisation where I'd left, but I'd heard about someone who actually, you know, took their life. And when I look back and I reflect on it, I wouldn't have known because they were someone in the office that, you know, were breezy, smiley. And so, the subtle signs feel really important.
Yeah, I saw an advert recently. I think it might have been Norwich City, the football fan advert, where, you know, you've got two fans, one very bubbly, the other looks kind of quite low, and they're going to the games, each game with each other. And then eventually only one of them turns up. And the guy that turns up is the guy who, throughout the advert, had seemed like he was low, and but actually it was the guy who came across as being very bubbly, very happy, enjoying things, that suddenly wasn't there anymore. And I think that goes to the point of the subtle signs of sometimes it's not always easy to see those signs.
I mean, that was a really powerful ad, wasn't it? I think some ads really stay with you, don't they? And I was thinking about the other advert that really stayed with me recently, which was about the young woman that went to the bar and people made assumptions about her and that she wouldn't be able to take up a full life and she had learning disabilities. And all of the judgments that ran through her life experience. And I think those two ads within the last year are the two that really stood out for me, because they really resonated and they really challenge us emotionally, don't they? And I think the things they have in common are the sense to which we think we know something, and then we live our life on that basis in how we interact with others. And actually what we don't do perhaps is challenge ourselves to think, what assumptions am I making and what don't I know? And the solution to that is always really to ask a question, is to ask the person and to ask them a question that goes underneath a veneer. And that doesn't always have to be, how do you feel? It can be a more concrete question about how their life is on a daily basis. But I think it does need to be personal enough that it asks them something about their experience. And we need to be confident enough that we're willing to ask a second time when they say, oh, fine, and they brush off. Because that's what we all tend to do. That's, you know, that's our societal norm, isn't it? So I think that's the first thing. And I think you spoke about how uncomfortable it can be sometimes to have those conversations, even though people care. But I think we also know ourselves probably a lot about what it feels like to struggle, and probably about how we come across. And I think by knowing ourselves, we can develop much more confidence in how we interact with others. So I think if we can think back and think, I've had some really good conversations with people sometimes when I've been struggling, and often they're not face to face. They're often shoulder to shoulder. They're often going for a walk with someone. They're having a coffee. They're when they ask a follow-up question to something that I've mentioned something, but then they come back with another question. Well, what was that like? How did that feel? How did you experience that? Often when they empathise, they say, oh, when I had young children, I'm giving you, it was amazing, but it's also quite tough. The sleep deprivation is gruelling. All those experiences where you share a bit of yourself and you make it okay to be vulnerable, I think is important. And modelling that is really important, and that comes from confidence. And I think when we know ourselves and are able to be vulnerable about our own experiences and share them, we can also then think about what it's like perhaps to carry vulnerability from characteristics. So I'm thinking about things that might be around gender, ethnicity, religion, relationship status, which really are the protected characteristics usually, and they're protected because in society people are discriminated against on the basis of those characteristics. So we do know what the list is. I think particularly thinking about neurodiversity, because it often comes late for people in thinking about those lists. But in construction it's really important to think about neurodiversity because it's a much higher proportion than the general population, we think. Interestingly similar in farming and agriculture. So we need to think about what's it like to be within an environment where perhaps I don't feel like my experience is the norm, and what might that, in terms of how I interact or how I take up space or how I experience things coming through decisions, the impact of those decisions. So I think particularly in construction, there's been quite a lot of focus on what it's like to be a woman working in construction and what that means if you're on a project. We also need to think about people who have English not as their first language in construction. What does that mean? What is that experience like? And how do we access some of that? What about cultural norms? So I think we do know about those factors, but what we don't know is that individual's experience of them. And I think that comes from building trusting relationships with people you work with and being open and up for the conversation, as well as coming from a sort of an informed position where you've taken responsibility for learning too. So, and I do think there's a risk, because I think sometimes we can think about somebody's vulnerability and that to them can feel exposing, so they can think they're going to be prejudged in some way. And I think it's really important we don't do that. We all have vulnerability and we all have strength. So it's about thinking at an individual level, what do I need to do to help this person work well? And how might this decision impact them differently to me or to somebody else I'm making a decision about? And that's when I was talking about that leadership intervention we're developing, which is about how we help leaders think about the impact of their decision making, particularly around mental health, which I think is important. But I think in terms of spotting the signs in yourself, what do you think is the key signs someone would see if you were distressed?
I mean, I could list many.
Yeah.
But, it might just be someone withdrawing, someone low mood, not their usual self, whatever that might be for that person. It could be anything and everything, but it could be the complete opposite. It could be becoming more extroverted, to feel that they need to fit in and comfort the anxieties that they're feeling. So probably quite vast.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that came to my mind was an obvious change in behaviour. Obviously, that you need to know that individual first to notice that.
One of the things that I think is important, and you'll know this from your training, is to trust your guts. So I think quite often we know a feeling. You can enter a room, can't you? Particularly if you think about your family. So if you go home to your family, and I'm thinking about sort of parents here or those that took care of you when you were growing up, you know if there's an edge in the room. You can read it. You might not get told, it might all look like everything's fine, the food might be going on the table, but you can feel that there's an edge in the room. So I think there's something about us trusting ourselves to actually be quite good at knowing when something's off. What we have to do is then be confident to speak it in a way that feels okay enough to ourselves and the other person to say, I'm wondering if, or I've noticed. And I think that confidence comes from practice, from saying, you know, I noticed this morning you were later than usual. Are you okay? Or, wow, you seem to have a lot more energy. Is everything good? Or what's going on? Or you seem quiet. Are you all right? I'm here if you need a chat. So I think there's something about that confidence and being able to say what we see, being able to say it in a way that doesn't feel judgmental, and trusting that our intent will come through. And I think that is something you have to practice. And if you can practice that with each other in organisations when there isn't a problem, it makes it much easier to practice when it does feel uncomfortable. So that's the sort of key, I think. And then I think that lends itself to that question of how do you benefit from the differences within your workforce, whether that's directly employed or sort of project-based, and the way in which people group with people that they feel comfortable with and similar to and have shared experiences with, without that feeling. And that's great, isn't it? Because familiarity is really helpful to people. That's how we stop people feeling isolated, because we like spending time with people we connect with, without it feeling like there are subgroups in a way that feels like silos or isolation for others. And I think that does come from developing confidence in having conversations. So saying, I've noticed that as a group you really get on and you have really great shared experience in some way. How could we know more about that? How could we benefit from that? How could we share that experience? How could we connect you with others in the organisation? Because actually we want a strong team where there's connection as well as strong relationships between a few people. We want relationships across the organisation. So I think you can directly have conversations with people. I certainly think there's something about giving opportunity for that to happen. I'm sure we've all been in organisation settings where those opportunities have been done well. And I think often that comes from having shared information beforehand. So express the intent, like we think it's really helpful to have difference because we all have strengths and we want to benefit from that difference by sharing information and learning and experience. And also, I think purposefully sharing learning about cultures within your organisation so that others get a bit of an insight into what it's like to be you or to be me. And I was thinking one of the projects that seems to have done that really well is Tideway. I don't know if you know the Tideway project.
Yeah, Thames Tideway, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they created, and it grew out of COVID as I understand it, they created Tideway tribes where they purposefully connected groups within their organisation that had things in common so that people felt less isolated during COVID. And interestingly, some of those tribes have continued post-COVID and formed really good networks of support. And they managed to do it in a way that both gave people connection within a group in a positive way, but also connection across the organisation. So I think that's a good example of a both and. There's the sort of benefit there of being connected to people that you have a commonality of experience with and the opportunity to connect across. And I wonder if that's a way to help so that you connect people on things. People might group naturally on something that's an easy thing to identify as having something in common with people on, but is there a way to connect people on something that they have something in common on that they don't know immediately?
Yeah, so helping them to find that commonality.
Yeah, creating relationships with people that might need some facilitation, because
Yeah.
the organisation might know something. You and your role in HR might know things about people that they don't know about each other. How do you help them find that out?
Yeah, creating the opportunities in a way.
Yeah, I think it's really key for leadership teams to develop or create an environment where these behaviours become the norm. So people in the organisation feel that as the norm and people feel comfortable having those conversations and creating those groups. I think there is quite a lot of onus on leadership teams to develop that, really.
Yeah, and I think to one of your earlier points, Sam, around the discomfort, even sometimes, you know, just around modelling, and sometimes as, you know, a member of a leadership team where you notice something and you have to sit with your discomfort and call it out, because if you're feeling that discomfort, then it's quite possible staff might be feeling that type of discomfort. And, you know, naming it in a way that's quite respectful and just going, you know, I felt really uncomfortable when you said that. And it might be about gender or age or disability, but just kind of, you know, speaking your voice and what's true to you around what you're feeling, your emotional literacy, and then hopefully translating to the wider staff force as well.
Yeah, absolutely. When you were saying that, I was thinking the key thing there is timing, isn't it? And I was thinking, I'm quite a long way on in my career, so I've probably been working 30 years and I don't have it yet, but I hope I have it a lot better than when I started. Early on in my career, if I felt discomfort about somebody saying something, particularly if I had a label for what they'd said, like I thought they'd discriminated in some way, I would find it very hard not to say it then and there. And I kind of felt I was being helpful probably doing that. And I think maybe that role at WPF actually really helped me think about shame and how shame operates at an individual level. And if we feel shamed, we all know it, don't we? If we feel shamed, we shut down.
Yeah.
And so there's something about how do we give people feedback without shaming them? Because if we shame them, they're not going to get the feedback and they're not going to change their behaviour. So I think that's a real change for me in thinking about how do we help people learn? How do we share our perspective in a way that doesn't feel shaming? And for some people, that's really hard to do, I think, because they are so likely to feel shamed because of what they're bringing from their background and their experience to that point. It can be really hard for somebody in a role at work to say something to you without it feel shaming, however well-intentioned that piece of feedback is. So I think that can be a real challenge, and I think that is a responsibility for us as leaders and managers and employers to learn to do that as well as we can, and to know we'll get it wrong sometimes, and if we do, to apologise, because that's important too, but to learn to do that as well as we can, and to think about timing for when we help people to do something differently. And it often isn't in the moment, isn't it? It's often not in the meeting, it often is afterwards. But again, I think the more we norm conversations and openness, the easier it is then to say things. And if you do get it wrong, the more tolerance there is for you having made a mistake and to apologise. So I think it's a challenging one for us all.
And I think there's something to be said around leadership and how you naturally try to gravitate towards that more positive conflict, because it is healthy, it is raising awareness, and it is with the intention to come together and do something better for everyone. But it's not easy. And sometimes it is about, to your point, about slowing down, taking the time, thinking about it again, thinking about it as a collective, and then knowing how to approach it.
I was thinking about that model of high support, high challenge. I love the ideal, theoretically, in an organisation in terms of your culture is you have high support at an interpersonal level and you have high challenge. And that allows you to be highly productive. And you can think about it, can't you, practically, if you're actually building something together, if you really get on with the person you're working with, you can really think creatively about how to solve a problem, and you can physically deliver a lot in the moment. But if you don't have high support, it's no good being high challenge. So the question first is always, how do we create high support relationships and then bring high challenge? And that's when you're going to really fly.
Yeah, I like that. And I guess my final point on the leadership piece was around how being aware of our power and our privilege, and how we use that to be that protective factor for staff and for individuals. And so, you know, for example, I've got someone quite close to me outside of CFS who quite suddenly started to have ill health and now has a disability, and had a very successful career in marketing and media ahead of that. And the one thing they still had left was work, essentially. And not getting the support that they needed, that part of their life has kind of come crashing down as well. So just, I guess that's just my final point around leadership, just being really aware of the impact that we have when people are struggling and they've got other risk factors in their life, and trying to keep that together for them. And just how we kind of raise our own awareness of that and our power in that.
I mean, work's really important for us, isn't it? Firstly, for most of us, it's how we provide for ourselves and our family. It's how we meet our really basic needs of having a roof over our heads and food on the table and heat. And so actually, work at that level is a really core need for us, isn't it? Because we need income from it. So I think for us, work is hugely important. And if we don't have stability in our workplace, and we don't trust that we're going to keep getting paid and work will be there for us and pay us fairly, then we are immensely vulnerable, and that gives us a very difficult feeling, and we feel very exposed. So I think first, work is that for most of us. But then on top of that, actually work for most of us also gives us a sense of meaning and purpose and value. It's how we take up our role in society. It's how we contribute to, in construction, where people are born, live and die. So I think, and in farming and agriculture, it's the food that we eat and the clothes that we wear. So these roles that we have, I don't think we can overstate how core they are to our lives and our identities. And for me, that means as employers, managers, leaders, we need to remember that we're holding something very powerful when we're thinking about holding someone's employment and their role, because we're holding the way in which they look after themselves and their family financially, and the way in which they identify often within the world, or a big part of how they identify and the meaning and purpose they feel they bring. So for me, that feels a huge responsibility and a privilege, and something that we need to think about if anything about that work role is changing, whether that's the hours you work, or the thing your job is called, or the way in which you're able to continue working if you become unwell, or your life outside changes in some way that changes that. And I don't think that means that work needs to become a replacement for the state. I think that, that's not what I'm suggesting, but I do think that we need to remember how important work is, and that it can be and should be good for us in wider ways than just finance.
And it's that constant tussle, isn't it? I feel it working in finance and HR, of how do we get that balance right between the business and the individual, and how do we do it with empathy and making the right decisions that kind of benefit both.
And it's a shared responsibility, isn't it? I talk about that a lot, that actually we have responsibility as individuals to show up well for work, and work has a responsibility to treat us well. And it should be a shared responsibility, and you should be able to have those conversations within the working relationships. And it's about holding that balance, isn't it? And at times it does shift. I think people are able to bring more or less to work, and work is able to support more or less. At times work asks more of us, doesn't it, for all sorts of reasons, and at times people are able to give slightly more or slightly less. But it's about holding that balance in the relationship, and I think it being openly discussed over time, so that whichever way the balance is shifting, you're able to talk about it openly and honestly.
I think, obviously, I'm speaking from a personal perspective now, because we've just partnered with Mates in Mind, which is obviously really exciting. So I'm just trying to get your opinion on how businesses can align with a charity, Mates in Mind or others, and maybe some of the organisational things they can do in having that partnership.
Well, I think the first thing that's really helpful is to talk about working with us and partnering with us, so that everybody that you work with knows, because we're a charity and we want to have impact, and we have impact by helping individuals improve their emotional literacy, become more confident and competent in those conversations, and by helping people that are in supporting and leading roles actually invite those conversations, facilitate them, encourage them, and signpost support, and then creating organisations that are good for mental health. So the first thing is talking about it, so people then start pulling that information through your organisation, and that's really helpful to us. Then it's about getting all those things in place, so making sure everyone knows how to have the conversations, anyone in a managing or leading role feels more competent, able to lead them, invite them, facilitate them. Thinking about how the people in your organisation that are really up for being mental health advocates, mental health first aiders often, are able to come together and act as change agents within the organisation. So people know that they're there, not just for a conversation, but maybe to share information, maybe to signpost, maybe to notice what's going on in other organisations and share learning. So I think that can bring energy and excitement and make it your very own way of doing it, because the way you do it in your organisation is going to be different to somebody else's. And I think that's interesting and exciting, and we can learn from that as a charity. And then we really enjoy sharing ideas and thinking about things that we can do together, whether that's fundraising, so that we can help others, whether it's about thinking about a particular project you want to try because you've noticed within your workforce there's a particular issue that you'd really like to try and help make change on, whether you want us to share some of our ideas and other people we work with. And then we love connecting people. So I think ultimately we know the best prevention is relationship with colleagues, with people outside work. Good relationships stop us feeling isolated and alone, even when we are burdened with problems. So we like to connect people. So we like to connect organisations that we work with. We like to connect people within those organisations with other organisations that we are doing good work with. And I think that allows sharing of ideas, sharing of resources. So they're the ways you can work with us, and you can connect with us on social media, you can connect with us at events, you can go on fundraising walks with us, you can climb mountains or go on bike rides or play golf, or come up with another idea that we haven't yet done, which we'd love to think about. So there's some of the ways. And then we have a lot of resources. So we really encourage you to share those, whether that's on your internal platform, if you have one where you share your information, or whether that's through apps, or whether that's through putting a poster up, or however people are going to receive the information.
I think that's great, because one of the questions I was going to have, which I think you've answered, is I guess engagement with wider stakeholders as well, because we know that obviously this is an issue across multiple organisations and industries, and we're obviously very keen to support our colleagues at CFS, but engaging with our supply chain, our customers, other businesses within the industry to kind of drive not just an organisational change but an industry change.
I think it was interesting before we started, wasn't it? 'Cause we were talking about people that we both knew. We started having conversations about how much connection there is within the sector and beyond. And also, I think what you also know is the people that you love working with and how often you end up working with them again. And I think, and introducing people to other people. So you think, they would connect really well with that person. This organisation's doing great work here. Can I connect them to that organisation so that together they can do something interesting? And I think we know that works well, and it works well in mental health. It works well in all sorts of ways, but it works well around mental health practice. So what's going on in your organisation? What's been effective? How can we connect you with another? Could your teams work together? Is there a shared project that we might be able to support on? Or is there something that you want to do where you think we could do this intervention and we want to try it? And often what we talk about is things, going back to the nuts and bolts, is we use an organisational assessment. So we encourage organisations when they join us, as you know, to do an assessment, which really helps you know where your strengths are and where you've got some gaps, us know how we can best support you to make sure that you're actually on that journey and making progress. And you can then look back and say, we did this. You can tell your teams, this is the journey we're taking. This is how we're going to take it. This is how we're investing and making improvement. I think that really helps people build trust. You can see if it's effective. Obviously, I come from a research background. I like to know that if we're going to do something, it's actually been effective. If not, let's change it and do something else. So I think that can really help. And by doing that, we can then think about which organisations are trying to do similar things, and then we can connect on that, which I think is helpful.
Well, thank you. From a personal perspective, I've really enjoyed the conversation that we've had today. I'm sure, obviously, Patrick and Sarina have too. You've shared so much valuable insight there, and I think we're all going to be going back through this and noting things down and trying to take some models away from this, and particularly for our own organisation. We're at the start of this journey, We know it's important, but we're under no illusion that we're very much at the start, and now it's all about what we do on an everyday basis to make sure that we drive the change. And so just to finish up is just to say a massive thank you for joining us today. We do really appreciate it. And you mentioned there the resources. Where's the best place for people to go to try and access some of those things? Is it on your website?
Definitely our website.
Yeah.
And then otherwise you can find us on social media. So you can find us on LinkedIn and you can find us on Facebook. But if you go to our website, then that's where you'll find us.